I want to be precise about what I was doing when it started, because people have asked me since, and the truth is not dramatic. I was counting linen. Specifically, I was cross-referencing the nursery wing's quarterly supply manifest against the physical inventory in the linen closet off the inner corridor, the narrow one behind the third door on the left, where the shelving unit sits slightly crooked because someone drove a service cart into the wall bracket 18 months ago, and the bracket was never properly reset. I had flagged the bracket 3 times in my maintenance reports. It was still crooked. I had stopped flagging it and started working around it, which is how most things get done in a palace. You flag the problem, no one fixes it, you adapt to the problem, and eventually you stop noticing the problem except when you are standing in the specific location where the problem lives. My name is Cale Drennan. I am 41 years old. I spent 12 years as a field medic with the Compact Auxiliary before a bilateral tendon injury ended my deployment eligibility. A thing that happened gradually and then all at once, the way those things tend to, until one day I could not move across a field site quickly enough to matter, and that was the end of what I had been. I spent the following 4 years in various supply and logistics roles that used the organizational part of what I knew and did not require me to move fast. Inventory systems, medical supply chains, procurement documentation, the work of keeping things in their places so that the people who needed them could find them. I was good at it. I was good at it in the way you are good at a thing that is not the thing you were made for, competently, reliably, without particular feeling. I was assigned to the Velmorin Royal Household Supply Coordination Team 8 months ago, specifically to the nursery wing, specifically because the previous coordinator had left the quarterly inventories 18 months out of date, and the shortfall in pediatric medical supplies had become, in the words of my supervisor Havoc, a situation requiring someone with a medical background who could also count. I could count. I had a medical background. I got the assignment. I was not, by any reasonable definition, a person of consequence in the Velmorin Royal Palace. I had a staff identification badge, gray, the lowest classification, supply tier, a small office adjacent to the linen closet, and a clear understanding that my function was to keep the nursery wing supplied and documented without requiring anyone of importance to think about it. I had met Queen Sereth Velmorin twice in 8 months. Once at a household assembly in the second week of my assignment, where she had addressed the full staff with the kind of composed, measured attention that suggested she was genuinely looking at the people in the room rather than performing the act of looking at them. She had spoken for approximately 4 minutes. I had stood in the back third of the assembly hall and listened, and thought she seemed like someone who meant what she said, which is not as common as it should be. The second time was in the corridor outside the nursery common room, 6 weeks into my assignment. She had been moving quickly, the controlled urgency of someone between 2 things that both required her, and I had been carrying a supply crate and had seen her coming and had pressed myself against the wall to let her pass. She had not looked at me. This was correct protocol for a supply tier staff member in a corridor, and I was not offended by it. I noted, because I notice things, that she moved the way people move when they know exactly where they are going and what they will do when they get there. Those were the 2 times, in 8 months. I want to establish all of this clearly because what happened on the night of the 14th of the 9th month is easier to understand if you know exactly what I was. A supply coordinator in a linen closet, doing a quarterly inventory on a night when the Queen was 3 days into a diplomatic summit on the far side of the compact, and was not expected back until the 17th. The first thing I noticed was the quiet. Palace corridors are not usually quiet at the 9th hour of the evening rotation. There are staff movements, cleaning rotations, meal service to the residential wings, the standard security patrols. I had worked the nursery wing for 8 months. I knew the sound of the building the way a field medic learns the sound of a camp, not consciously, but as a background register that your body tracks without being asked, because in field medicine the ambient sound is diagnostic. A camp that is too quiet is a camp that knows something you don't yet know. You learn to listen to the shape of the silence. The corridor outside the linen closet had been steadily quieter for about 40 minutes before I acknowledged it to myself. I had been noting it without naming it, a pattern recognition instinct that had been running in the background while I counted pillow covers and annotated the manifest. At some point in those 40 minutes, I had stopped hearing the regular sound of the guard rotation passing the junction at the end of the wing. At some point, I had stopped hearing the evening kitchen service carts in the main corridor 2 turns away. The building had gone quiet in a particular direction, and the direction was toward me. I finished the linen count. I noted the discrepancy in the pillow covers 7 short, which I had expected and had already drafted an order for, and I closed the manifest and set it on the supply office desk and stepped into the corridor. Empty. Not the ordinary empty of a corridor between movements. Empty in a specific way I had learned to recognize in 12 years of field work. The way a position goes quiet when the people who know what is wrong have already begun moving away from it. A purposeful, directional emptiness. The kind that tells you something has changed, and the change has a shape. I stood in the corridor for approximately 10 seconds, running through what I knew. The Queen was off-site. The children were in the nursery wing. The evening attendance rotation ended at the 10th hour. The Royal Guard posted 2 members at the corridor junction on the evening rotation, which should have been audible. I should have heard the patrol change at the 9th hour and 40 minutes. I had not heard it. I walked to the nursery common room. The 3 royal children were there. Princess Aval, who was 9, was sitting at the reading table with a text scroll open in front of her that she was clearly not reading. Her eyes were in the middle distance, and she had the very composed expression of a child who had decided to be calm and was working hard at it. Prince Sarath, who was 6, was on the floor beside the low-cushioned bench, arranging small carved stone figures into a formation that he had apparently been rearranging for some time, based on the faint sliding sound I had been intermittently hearing through the linen closet wall for the past hour. He was placing the larger figures at the point facing the doorway, and the smaller figures in a cluster behind them. The youngest, Princess Care, who was 3.5, was asleep on the cushioned bench with her dark head on a folded blanket, one hand curled loosely near her face. The evening attendant was not there. The security post at the corridor junction, 2 members of the Royal Guard, standard evening assignment, was not staffed. Aval looked up at me when I came in. She had her mother's eyes, that deep amber gold that caught the room's light and gave it back steadily. And she had the particular expression of a child who is old enough to know that something is wrong and still young enough to believe that an adult appearing in the doorway means the problem is being handled. I was a supply coordinator carrying a linen inventory clipboard. I was not sure I was the adult she needed. I was, however, the adult who was there. I said, "Where is Attendant Vale?" Aval said, "She said she needed to check something and would be back. That was a long time ago." I said, "How long ago?" She thought about it with the careful thoroughness she apparently applied to everything. She said, "Before Care fell asleep. Care falls asleep at the 8th hour. The 8th hour was 53 minutes ago." I said, "All right." I came fully into the room and sat down on the low bench near Sarath's arrangement. I did this deliberately, slowly, without urgency, because in 12 years of field medicine I had learned that the way you move through a space where children are frightened matters more in the first 30 seconds than anything you say. You sit down. You make yourself the size of ordinary things. You let them see that you have assessed the room and the room is manageable, even if you are not certain yet that it is. Sarath looked up at me and then back at his figures. He said, "The big one is the Queen's Guard, the small ones are us." I said, "That's a good arrangement." He said, "They're supposed to stay in front, but I keep moving them to the side, because that's where the door is." I said, that makes sense. You want them covering the approach. He nodded, satisfied, and adjusted the tallest figure a fraction to the left. I spent 2 minutes in that room. I spoke at a normal conversational volume. I did not move quickly. I asked Sareth about the figures. They were carved from local stone. He told me. His father had given them to him. The Queen's Guard ones were darker because they came from a different quarry. And I listened to him tell me about them with the attentiveness I would have given a patient describing symptoms. Because what he was telling me, in the language of a 6-year-old with a pocket full of carved stone, was that he was frightened and had been frightened before and had developed a system for managing it. Then I used my staff communicator to attempt contact with the household supervisor's station. No response after 30 seconds. I tried the medical bay on the second ring. No response. I tried the kitchen coordination station, which maintained staff until the 10th hour and which I used occasionally for supply queries. A response came back after a long pause. The voice was not the kitchen coordinator. I knew Veth's voice well enough from 8 months of supply negotiations, and this was not it. It was a voice I did not recognize, speaking in the deliberate, neutral register of someone who had been placed at a station and told to manage incoming contacts. The voice told me that the kitchen station was temporarily operating under centralized management, and that all staff should remain in their current assignments and await further instruction. I said, understood, thank you. I closed the channel. I sat with what I knew for approximately 30 seconds. Then I went back to my supply office and opened the bottom drawer of my desk. The field kit was there where it had been for 8 months. I pulled it out and set it on the desk. Compact medical kit, trauma supplies, light source, compressed nutrition packs, personal medication, and the charge cell emergency communicator, which operated on the compact auxiliary secondary frequency rather than the Palace network. I had kept both out of habit and mild professional embarrassment, because supply coordinators in Royal Nursery wings do not typically require field kits, and carrying one suggested a person who had not entirely settled into what he now was. I had told myself I would take it home and leave it there, and I had not done it, and now I was grateful I hadn't. I also took the linen inventory clipboard from the desk. I had found, over 12 years in situations that required me to move through spaces where I was not expected or not entirely welcome, that carrying something that looked like documentation made me appear purposeful rather than threatening. The linen clipboard was not documentation for anything that mattered tonight, but it looked like documentation, and sometimes that is enough. I went back to the common room. I said, calmly and without particular emphasis, "We're going to move to the inner rest room for sleeping tonight. It will be more comfortable." This was not entirely accurate. The inner rest room was smaller and had harder furniture, but it had one door with a manual lock, and it sat at the end of a corridor with 2 right-angle turns between it and the main junction, which meant that anyone moving toward it would be audible for long enough to matter. Aval looked at me steadily. She said, "Is something wrong?" I said, "I don't know yet. I'm being careful in case there is." She held my gaze for a moment. Then she said, "All right." She gathered the text scroll and her reading stylus with the kind of precise, unhurried care that you see in people who have been taught composure and are now practicing it under conditions that require it. I watched her do it and felt something I can only describe as respect, which is not the emotion you expect to feel about a 9-year-old, but there it was. Sareth gathered his carved figures. Every single one, the guard figures and the smaller ones and 3 pieces I had not noticed, tucked behind the bench cushion. He distributed them into his various pockets with the efficiency of a child who had learned that the things that matter should be on your person and not left behind. I carried Care, who did not wake. She was heavier than she looked, the way sleeping children always are, that complete, unself-conscious weight. We were in the inner rest room for roughly 40 minutes before the first interruption. I had set up the charge cell communicator on the secondary frequency and sent a status notation to the compact auxiliary emergency relay station 2 sectors over. Not a distress call. A distress call would have triggered a formal response protocol that might have complicated whatever was happening in the palace in ways I could not predict and could not manage from a nursery corridor. Instead, I sent a timestamped status notation with our location identifier and a single line of text. 3 royal minors in nursery wing inner rest room. Supply coordinator in attendance. Palace network non-responsive. It was the kind of message that field medics and supply coordinators sent when they wanted there to be a record, in case the record became necessary. Then I confirmed receipt, noted the timestamp, and put the communicator in my coat pocket where I could reach it quickly. Then I went and sat on the floor outside the inner rest room door with my back against the wall and the linen clipboard across my knees, and I waited. Aval had declined to sleep. I had not argued with her. She was 9 years old and she had made a decision, and I respected it. She sat on the short bench just inside the open doorway with her text scroll in her lap, and every 15 or 20 minutes she would look up and confirm that I was still there. I would nod. She would return to the scroll, which she was clearly not reading but which she was clearly finding useful as an object to hold. I had been in a lot of waiting positions over 12 years of field work. Corridor vigils, perimeter holds, the long hours outside surgical units where there was nothing to do but be present and available. You develop a relationship with waiting that most people in ordinary occupations do not have. You learn the texture of it, the different weights of different kinds of waiting. The way an hour can be long or short depending entirely on what you are waiting for, and whether the waiting itself is doing something useful. The waiting that night was useful. Every hour I kept the corridor clear was an hour the Queen was somewhere moving toward us. I did not know that with certainty. I believed it, which in the absence of certainty is what you work with. Around the first hour, Aval said, "Do you have children?" I said no. She said, "But you know how to be around them." I said, "I spent 12 years as a field medic. I worked a lot of refugee camp postings. Children are part of the work." She thought about that. She said, "What is a refugee camp?" I described it as simply as I could, a temporary settlement for people who had been displaced from their homes, who were waiting to find out what came next. She listened carefully, the way she listened to everything. Then she said, "What did you do there?" I said, "Medical care, triage primarily, deciding who needed treatment most urgently, organization, making sure supplies were where they needed to be, and waiting a lot of the time. Being present in spaces where things might be needed." She said, "Like now?" I said, "Like now." She was quiet for a while. Then she said, "My tutor says that presence is undervalued as a skill, that most people focus on action, but what many situations require is simply for someone to be in the right place and not leave." I said, "Your tutor is correct." She said, "I'm going to tell her you said so. She'll like that." There was something in her voice when she said it, a small warmth, an ordinary future, a tutor she was going to see tomorrow and report something to. Children hold the future as a present tense thing in a way that adults sometimes lose. I noticed it and I was glad of it. Sarath fell asleep with his hand in the pocket that contained the carved figures. Care had not woken. The first interruption. 2 members of the household maintenance staff I did not recognize, moving with the particular purposeful quality of people who had been sent to accomplish a specific thing and expected to accomplish it. They came around the second right-angle turn, saw me on the floor outside the door and stopped. The one in front said, "Coordinator, Lord Steward Verk has directed that the royal children be relocated to the East Wing for their protection. We're here to facilitate the transfer." I said, "I'll need a movement authorization logged in the household care system before I can transfer custody of the children." He said, The system is operating under centralized management tonight. The authorization was issued verbally by the Lord Steward's office. I said, verbal authorizations for minor royal transfer still require a confirming notation in the medical care record. That's the protocol for unaccompanied minors. I held the linen clipboard slightly forward, the way you hold documentation when you want the other person to see that documentation exists. I can submit the confirmation request through the emergency relay. It should clear in under 20 minutes. This was not a real protocol. It was something I assembled in real time out of the procedural vocabulary I had accumulated over 12 years of navigating bureaucratic systems in field conditions, where you frequently need to say something official enough to create a pause without being specific enough to be immediately refuted. I said it with the flat, professional confidence of someone who has said many official things in many corridors, and it had the effect I was hoping for. The man in front paused and recalculated whether I was worth the complication. He said 20 minutes. I said, I'll submit the request now. They left, moving back around the turn. I did not submit any request. I used the 20 minutes to check the door lock, confirm that both Sarath and Care were still asleep, and review what I had available to me, which was a field medical kit, a charge cell communicator on a secondary frequency, a linen inventory clipboard, and no particular authority over anything in this building. They returned in 11 minutes, not 20, with a third man, a senior household official named Torval, whose registry entry I had looked up once when I needed a signature on a medical supply exemption form. He held a mid-level administrative position in the Lord Steward's office. He had the look of a man who had been given a task he considered beneath him and was going to complete it without unnecessary elaboration. He said, Coordinator Drennan, Lord Steward Verk has assumed interim household authority in the Queen's absence. The children are to be moved to the East Wing under his personal protection. This is not a request. I said, I understand. I'll need a physical authorization document countersigned by a member of the Queen's Guard or direct confirmation from the Queen. Torval said, the Queen's Guard is deployed to a secondary perimeter situation. I said, then I'll need to confirm with the Queen. The emergency relay should be able to reach her diplomatic transit channel. Torval said, the Queen's channel is not available at this time. I said, then I'll remain with the children here until one of those conditions is met. Authorization document from the Queen's Guard or direct royal confirmation. Those are the two conditions for non-guardian custody transfer of minor royals in a medical-adjacent hold. I held up the clipboard again. The clipboard contained an inventory of pillow covers. I was fully aware that the clipboard contained an inventory of pillow covers. I held it up with absolute conviction. Torval looked at me for a long moment. He was, I assessed, calculating the value of pressing the matter further against the risk of creating a documented incident with a staff member who was clearly going to keep producing documentation requirements. A supply coordinator with a medical background and a clipboard is, in certain circumstances, a more complicated obstacle than a security detail, because security details can be moved physically and supply coordinators can be moved physically too. But then someone has to explain the supply coordinator in the incident report. He said, this is being noted, coordinator. You will remain here and await further instruction. He left, both the others went with him. I let out a slow breath and sat back down. From the doorway, Aval said quietly, you made those protocols up. I said, I constructed them from applicable principles. She thought about this. She said, is there a difference? I said, in medicine, a protocol is a formalized best practice, something that has been determined by accumulated experience to be the correct approach. If you're in a situation the existing protocols don't cover, you build a provisional protocol from first principles, what makes clinical sense, and what you can justify if someone reviews it later. I can justify what I said. Aval considered this with the same careful attention she gave everything. Then she said, "All right." She went back to the bench and her scroll. A few minutes later she said, without looking up, "Sarath's figures, the way he arranges them, he puts the tallest ones at the door." I said, "Yes." She said, "He started doing it after our father died. He makes a perimeter with the guard figures and puts us behind it." A pause. "He never says why, but that's why." I did not respond to this, because it was not the kind of statement that requires a response. It is the kind of statement that requires a listener, someone to receive it without deflecting it or filling the space it opens. I had learned this in field medicine too, sitting with people in the hours after difficult things, when they need to say something true out loud to someone who will hold it without trying to fix it. After a while she said simply, "Thank you for staying." I said, "The children are here. Someone has to be." The second attempt came at the second hour of the night rotation, and it was different. No administrative framing. 2 men in household security livery. The Lord Steward's personal detail, a designation separate from the Royal Guard, who came around the turn, moving with the compact, controlled quality of people who had been told to complete a task and were not planning to be redirected by documentation requirements. I stood up. I was a supply coordinator with a bilateral tendon injury and no weapon and a clipboard that contained a pillow cover inventory. And I stood up anyway, because the door behind me had 2 sleeping children and a 9-year-old inside it, and there was no calculation where that changed anything about what I was going to do. I said, "The children are under medical observation for a suspected respiratory presentation. I'll need to notify the palace medical officer before any movement can proceed, and I'll need to log a quarantine breach notification with the Compact Health Authority if this corridor is accessed without medical authorization." I held up the charge cell communicator. "I have an open channel." The one in front said, "Stand aside, coordinator." I said, "I'm not able to do that during an active medical hold. The health authority notification takes approximately 4 minutes. If the situation is not a quarantine concern, the notation will be cleared and I'll have no further grounds to maintain the hold. But I need to submit it either way, because if there is a contagion event and I didn't log the potential breach, that's a reportable failure on my record." I said all of this with the same flat professional confidence I had been using all evening, and I held the communicator up, and I looked at the man in front of me with the expression I had developed in 12 years of standing between things that were happening and things I did not want to happen, not defiant, not aggressive, just very clear about where I was standing and that I was going to remain standing there. The 2 of them looked at each other. Then the one in front said, "Verify with the Lord Steward," and they left. I sat back down. My hands were steady. 12 years of field medicine does that to you, teaches your hands to stay steady regardless of what the rest of you is doing. The hands are the tools. The tools have to work. Everything else is internal. From inside, Kale, Aval's voice low and careful. I said, "Yes." She said, "Are you all right?" I said, "Yes." A pause, then, "You don't have to say yes if it isn't true." I thought about that. I said, "It's true enough, and the people who just left are going to check with whoever sent them, and checking takes time, and time is what we need." She said, "How much time?" I said, "I don't know, but more than we had an hour ago." She was quiet. Then she said, "My mother is going to come." I said, "Yes." She said it not as a question but as a statement, the kind of certainty that isn't wishful thinking but something closer to structural understanding. Her mother was going to come because her mother was that kind of person. I had met her twice. I had seen enough. I said, "I know." Aval said, "I know you know. I just wanted to say it out loud." I said, "That's fair." She went quiet. From somewhere inside, Sareth made a small sound in his sleep, the kind of adjustment noise that children make when they are dreaming something busy, and then settled. Care had not moved in 2 hours. I sat in the corridor, and I thought about the choices people had made that night. The attendant who had left. The guard rotation that had been redirected. The kitchen staff member who had answered on a channel that should have been Veth's voice and wasn't. None of those were necessarily bad people. In field conditions, you learned quickly that most poor choices were not made by bad people, but by ordinary people in situations where the cost of the poor choice seemed lower than the cost of the right one. The attendant had probably been frightened. The guard rotation had probably been given an order from someone with authority to give orders. The kitchen staff member had probably been placed at that station and told what to say and had said it. Every one of them had made a calculation. I had made a calculation too, in the linen closet when I heard the wrong kind of quiet. I had calculated that I was going to walk to the common room and see what was there, and when I saw what was there, I had calculated that I was going to stay. I hadn't had much information. I hadn't had any particular authority. I had a field kit in my bottom drawer and 12 years of practice at being in difficult places and not leaving them. That was all, that was enough. I listened to the building around me. It was quiet in the wrong direction still, the absence of the sounds that should have been there, the guard rotation, the cleaning staff, the ordinary hum of a palace at night. But the quiet had a different quality now than it had at the 9th hour. It was the quiet of a situation that had already peaked and was now in a different phase, not the gathering quiet before something happens, but the settling quiet after. I could not have explained exactly why I thought that. I thought it anyway, and I held it and I waited. The Queen arrived at the 3rd hour of the night rotation. I learned what had happened afterward in pieces, from Havoc, and from the formal incident documentation, and from things that were mentioned in my presence over the following weeks. She had been reached through a secondary communication channel, a trusted advisor, a specific coded phrase that meant what it meant and required no elaboration. She had departed the summit without formal announcement, which was a diplomatic complexity that her staff handled in her absence with the kind of professionalism that suggested they had contingency protocols for exactly this situation. She had covered 3 sectors in 4 hours by requisitioning a courier vessel rather than waiting for the state transport. She had been in the palace for 8 minutes before she reached the nursery wing. In those 8 minutes, I was told, she had assessed the main corridor, located 2 members of the Lord Steward's detail, spoken with them in terms that the incident report described as direct and specific, and dispatched a communication to the compact auxiliary outpost that would reach the duty officer before the end of his rotation. Lord Steward Verk was in the household administrative office when she reached him. The conversation, by all accounts, was brief. I did not know any of this when I heard footsteps coming around the second right-angle turn. I had been hearing footsteps all evening, and I had learned to identify them before they arrived. The hesitant shuffle of people who had been sent somewhere and weren't sure they wanted to go, the deliberate stride of people completing an assigned task, the quick step of someone moving with urgency they were trying not to show. I had gotten good at it, the way you get good at things you do repeatedly in a single night. These footsteps were different. The rhythm was different, not the stride of someone sent, but the controlled precision of someone going somewhere specific that they had chosen to go. And it was one set of footsteps, not 2 or 3. Whoever was coming had come alone. Queen Sareth Velmorn came around the turn. She was in her diplomatic traveling clothes, a structured dark coat over a high-collared inner garment, both slightly creased from 4 hours in a courier vessel. Her silver hair was still close-spinned, the formal arrangement she would have worn for 3 days of summit work. She looked exactly like someone who had been composed for a very long time and was going to remain composed for a little longer, because she had not yet arrived at the place where she could stop. She stopped when she saw me. I was on the floor with my back against the wall and the clipboard across my knees, which is where I had been for most of 3 hours, and I looked up at her and said, "Your Majesty." I did not bow. The corridor was narrow and I had been on the floor for 3 hours, and something in the quality of her arriving made bowing feel like the wrong shape for the moment. She looked at me, then she looked at the door. She said, "They're inside." I said, "Yes, Aval is awake. The younger two have been asleep for a while." She held very still for a moment. Something moved through her expression, not quite relief, because relief implies that you had been holding a specific fear and could now release it, and I think the specific thing she had been holding for 4 hours in a courier vessel was something she had deliberately not looked at directly, because looking at it directly would have made the 4 hours impossible to get through. It was something adjacent to relief, the particular easing that happens when you arrive, and the thing you were afraid of is not there. She said, "You're the supply coordinator." I said, "Kale Drennan." "Yes, Your Majesty." She looked at me in the way I had seen her look at the assembly hall 8 months ago. The way that suggests you are actually seeing the person in front of you rather than the category they represent. She said, "How many times did they try?" I said, "Twice. Administrative framing the first time. Security detail the second. I told them the children were under a medical observation hold and that any movement would require health authority notification." A pause. "I want to note, for the incident record, that the children are not under a medical hold and there was no respiratory concern." She said, "I know." I said, "I intended to document the invented protocol in my incident report." Something shifted in her expression. Not quite a smile. The night was not at the place where smiles were the right shape, but something in that vicinity. She said, "That was well done." I said, "It was what I had available." She held my gaze. The amber gold of her eyes in the corridor's dim night panels was steady in the particular way that is not natural but practiced, the stillness that comes from years of learning to hold your expression while other things are happening inside it. I had been cultivating that same kind of steadiness all evening. I recognized it. She said, "Will you stay until morning?" I said, "Yes." She said, "I'm going to go in and sit with them. The guard rotation is being restored. The Lord Steward has been detained. But I would like someone I trust at this door." She said it without particular emphasis, not as a formal statement, just as a fact about the current situation and what she needed from it. Someone I trust. 3 hours of a closed door and a man on the floor outside it with a linen clipboard, and she had said that word. I said, "I'll be here." She held my gaze for one more moment. Then she went to the door and pushed it open, and I heard Aval's voice, the particular release of a child who has been holding herself together for a long time and can finally stop. And I heard the Queen's voice answering her, lower and quieter, and I did not hear the words, but I heard what was underneath them. The sound of a person who has been frightened arriving at the thing they were frightened for and finding it whole. I sat back down on the floor. I put the clipboard across my knees. I leaned my head back against the wall and looked at the pale stone across the corridor, which held the light evenly and without emphasis, and I listened to the sound coming through the closed door, a child's voice, a mother's voice, a small sound that might have been Sareth waking and saying something sleepily, another voice answering him. And then after a while the lower sound of Care's voice too, drowsy and indistinct, and the Queen's voice again in response, steady and unhurried. The kind of voice you use when you want someone to understand that the emergency is over and everything is as it should be. I thought about what she had said, "Someone I trust." I had been turning those words over in my mind since she said them, not because they seemed excessive, but because they were precisely accurate, and precision in that kind of statement is worth attending to. She had not said someone reliable, which would have been a different kind of acknowledgement, competent, documented, a supply coordinator who had performed correctly. She had said someone I trust, which is a different category. Trust is not about performance. It is about a specific quality of presence, the knowledge that a person will be where they said they would be, doing what needs to be done, without requiring management. I had spent 8 months in this palace as a man of no consequence. I had been passed in a corridor. I had counted pillow covers and flagged a crooked bracket and kept the pediatric medical supplies at appropriate levels. I had not been looking for a chance to be something more than what I was. I had simply been where I was assigned to be, doing what the assignment required, on a night when that turned out to matter. Every ranked person in the palace had made a calculation. The Lord Steward had calculated that the Queen's absence created an opportunity. The administrative staff had calculated that the Lord Steward's position was the correct alignment. The guard rotation had calculated that their orders superseded their post. I had not made a calculation of that kind. I had not been in a position to make one. I had no stake in the political landscape of the palace, no relationship to Lord Steward Verk that could be leveraged or protected, no calculation available to me except the most basic one. The children were there, and the corridor was empty, and I was the person in the corridor. I sat against the wall and I listened to the sound from inside the room, and after a while it went quiet in the right way, the settled quiet of 3 children who had fallen asleep again. And then I heard the Queen's voice one more time, low and clear, saying something I could not make out, and then silence. At some point I heard footsteps in the main corridor, the particular sound of the royal guard returning to the junction post, the measured 2-step of a standard perimeter resumption. The right kind of sound, the building going back to what it was supposed to be. I stayed where I was until morning. 3 weeks later, I was in my supply office cross-referencing the pillow cover discrepancy, which had grown to 9 short, because I had been occupied with incident documentation and interviews, and a formal deposition regarding the events of the 14th, and no one had submitted the replacement order in my absence, when there was a knock at the door frame. I looked up. The Queen was standing at the door of my supply office. She was in her working clothes, the practical mid-weight coat she wore for the daytime administrative hours, not the formal court attire. In the 3 weeks since the 14th, I had learned that she had a habit of moving through the nursery wing in the late morning between the children's lesson period and the midday meal. She apparently always had. I had simply not been positioned to observe it during my first 7 months of assignment, because supply coordinators in linen closets do not typically see the Queen's casual morning route. I stood up. She said, "Sit down, please." I sat down. She came into the office. There was a second chair, a small, practical thing that I used for staff meetings with the nursery wing attendants, and she pulled it away from the wall and sat in it without ceremony, the way she apparently did everything when ceremony wasn't required. She said, "I wanted to thank you properly. I haven't had the opportunity with the inquiry." I said it wasn't and stopped, because I had been about to say unnecessary, which was reflexive and not entirely honest. I had decided, in the 3 weeks since the 14th, to try to be less reflexive about things and more honest about them. I had spent 12 years being professionally reflexive, and it had served me well in field conditions and less well in everything else. She waited. I said, "I'm glad I was there." She said, "Everyone in the palace that night made a choice. The attendant who left, the guard rotation that was redirected, the administrative staff who decided the Lord Steward's position was the correct alignment. Those are choices." She looked at me steadily. "You made a choice too. I wanted to acknowledge it." I said I didn't have much context when I made it. I didn't know what was happening in the palace. I just knew that the children were there, and the corridor was empty, and someone needed to be in it. She said yes, something quiet in the word, not agreement exactly, but recognition of something specific. That's what I wanted to acknowledge. She looked around my supply office for a moment. The inventory shelves, the crooked bracket on the linen closet door that was still unrepaired because the maintenance request was still processing, the quarterly manifest stacked on the corner of the desk, the bottom drawer slightly open where the field kit was visible. She looked at the field kit. She said, "You kept that in the drawer." I said, "Habit. I kept meaning to take it home." She said, "I'm glad you didn't." She looked back at me. She said, "The Lord Steward's office will need a new administrative coordinator. The position has considerably broader scope than your current role. I thought you should be offered it." I said I wouldn't want it. She said, "No, I thought you probably wouldn't." Something in her expression, not amusement exactly, but something informed by it. The inquiry panel suggested the household guard vacancy. I said I'm not qualified for guard work, the tendon. She said no, a pause. They also suggested a formal commendation. I said that seems excessive. She looked at me for a moment with an expression I couldn't categorize, the particular quality of someone who is assessing something they hadn't fully anticipated. She said, "You held a corridor for 3 hours with a medical kit and a linen clipboard, and you think a commendation is excessive." I said I didn't hold it, I managed it. There's a difference. Holding implies force. I produced documentation requirements. She said, "You produced documentation requirements that worked." I said, "They worked because no one wanted the record." That's a different thing from force. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Aval asked me your name last week. She said she knew it from the night of the 14th but wanted to confirm she had it right." I said, "Tell her she does." She said, "I will." She stood up and returned the chair to its place against the wall with the same practical precision she had used to pull it out. At the door she paused without turning. She said, "How is the tendon?" I said, "Better in cold weather." She said, "The nursery wing runs cold." I said, "I've noticed." She said, "Good," and she left. I sat in my supply office with the supply manifest in front of me, and the field kit visible in the open drawer, and the bracket still crooked on the linen closet door, and the building around me had the ordinary sound of a morning, people where they were supposed to be, movements that made sense, the quiet that comes from things being in their right places. I pulled the pillow cover order form toward me and found my place. 9 short. I wrote it down. I wrote down the bracket too, and I noted it with the same level annotation I had been using for 18 months, because eventually someone would fix it or I would stop noting it, and either way I would document it correctly in the meantime. The manifest was exactly what it was. The morning was exactly what it was. I found my place in it, and I kept on.